Okay, thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Particularly thanks to the speakers who are going to make this possible. So welcome all to the seventh East-West workshop on industrial archaeology. I am Juan Manuel Cano Sanchez from University of Science and Technology, Beijing in China, and also a council member of the Association for Industrial Archaeology that, as you know already, are the two institutions behind this series of workshops that aims to bring together colleagues from the East, from the West, and from the rest of the world, actually, to exchange experiences about the heritage and archaeology of the industrial past. Today, I think we are pretty lucky because we have three brilliant speakers with plenty of expertise on the heritage and the archaeology of the textile industry, which is going to be the main topic today. We have two TICI national representative. As you know, TICI stands for the International Committee for the Conservation of the Industrial Heritage. So we have Yiping Dong from China and Mark Watson from the UK. And we also have the co-editor of Industrial Archaeology Review. So very good speakers indeed to travel around the historical textiles factories of the world. Today we are going to start this journey in the Far East. We will learn how the exchanges between the West and the East were behind some of the earliest industrial and modern buildings in China. From there, we will move west to Britain, where we are going to see what archaeology can tell us about the industrial past, more specifically about the textile industry with the excavation and the archaeological research of Salford Twist Mill. And finally, we are going to finish this journey today with a global look at the heritage of the textile industry, which is a heritage that embodies these multiple technological transfers and international exchanges. So I think this is a kind of heritage of globalization, but still, that does not mean that there are not national or even local singularities that deserve attention to. So as Bill has just reminded us, please keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentation so we can focus on what the speakers are telling to us. At the end of the three presentations, we will have some time for questions and answers. We will have some time for discussion. Until that moment, well, in that moment, you are very welcome to open your microphone and camera if you want to do so. And in the meantime, please feel free to use the chat facility here in Zoom to make your comments, questions, or to share any idea that you are willing to share. So welcome everybody. Thanks again to the speakers and to the institution supporting this series of workshops. And we move to the first presentation, which is complexity of the conservation of textile heritage in China. This presentation is going to be delivered by Dr. Yiping Dong, who is an associate professor in the Department of Architecture of the Design School at Chiang Jiatong Liverpool University, where she coordinates the History, Theory, and Heritage Lab. Dr. Dong, she has many positions. In China, for example, she is the Deputy Secretary of the Urban Rural Built Heritage Committee of the Architectural Society of China. She is also an academic member of the Industrial Architectural Heritage Academic Committee of China. And internationally, she is a board member of TICI and also the national representative for China, as well as vice president of the Association of Critical Heritage Studies. Professor Dong is an architect, architectural historian, and conservationist that has many research interests, but today she is going to talk about industrial heritage. So please, Professor Dong, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Huan Janet. I was very honored to be invited to this East and West workshop on industrial archaeology. I really started my academic research in the topic of industrial heritage since my PhD dissertation, and that also been very much inspired by the industrial archaeologist publications in the AIA. So I'm really honored to be here today and also communicate my research on the heritage, particularly their textile heritage cases in China. Let me share my screen now. Not this one, sorry. I need to open that and then share the screen. Share the screen here. Yes. Is the screen shared okay?
Yes, it's working
Okay.
great.
Oh, it's okay. My topic is about the complexity of conservation of textile heritage in China, and I would take one particular case area in Shanghai for the study. But of course, I will start with something more general, as we probably today their audience are more familiar about why industrial heritage was so important for our society, and also why industrial heritage is is being considered as valuable, memorable things for its physical remains. And Robert Hewison, his writing gives me a lot of inspiration during my thesis writing. And also during my thesis, I developed a research discussion about how those unintentioned industrial remains, those not designed for long-term conservation, like monuments, architecture, why they are considered as valuable things and through which process they were being considered as historical buildings, listed buildings in different cultural contexts. So particularly the value perception is very important through a discussion by different bodies like the different like architecture society and also engineer society. They all started to make more discussions about those like monumental buildings in the 1950s to the contemporary. Those started in one process of heritage making in historical buildings like textile mills. So after my thesis, I started to do one particular thematic study on the textile mills, which is also inspired by a very important TV, but not TV. It's a very important novel by Elizabeth Gaskell, who describes the North and South, that is the division, different development in the textile, in particular the North city in England. So I love this TV, and I also read the novel, and then I started to think about why textile industry is so important in the discussion. And then there Tiki, I started to be a Tiki member since 2004, and that also inspired a lot for my research. So I read the thematic study about different industry in the Tiki document, like the international context for textile sites. I think today Dr. Watsons is also here. I may learn more from this part. So I think textile industry has a long and also impact for the urbanization, particularly for like a modern period for architecture as well. Manchester as a great Manchester city with a lot of textile mills. And when I had a chance to visit Manchester in 2008, I also get the visit to those museums and also those big factory buildings in the Manchester region, the Great Manchester region, and also learned this technology development for those different architecture forms and typologies and particularly the technology development related to textile productions in the British context. And when that was another discussion about industrial heritage nomination to the World Heritage Sites, we see in Japan, the first modern silk mill, Tomiyako, is been listed in 2009 or 2010. I cannot remember exactly, but this discussion also gives a quite interesting topic about how those Western technology was introduced into the Eastern Asia context and how this Eastern Asia local craftswork are connected to the introduction of those Western technology. And this is a technology transfer discussion. So we see the French engineer were invited to Japan to develop this cocoon warehouse and also the main manufacturing building in the late 19th century. So when I came back to my working place, that is in Suzhou and Shanghai, this is a Yangtze Delta area, I'm thinking about why the textile history here is so long and how this textile history from the handicraft has been transformed into the modern manufacturing, very similar to the UK and also similar to the Japanese practice in the past. This is the Yangtze Delta region, and in the tradition, there's a very important cocoon production with the silk fabrications in this region. And later in the 16th century, this became a main production site for cotton and also the clothes made by looms. However, in the beginning of the First Opium War and later the beginning of the 19th century, the whole area started to taking the modern manufacturing for those products. This is the region we were working in the past years to highlight those industrial heritage sites in the Yangtze Delta region. Shanghai is the most dense area, and Suzhou and also Wuxi, Changzhou, and Nantong, those are the relatively later cases impacted by Shanghai. But recently, these places are under reuse, and that is particularly interested about the interior space, the volumes for creative industry, for office buildings. So I had a discussion of why this building should be used only for those programs. Is this adaptive reuse or is this adaptive upuse? Are those features from the industrial past has been acknowledged, or they are still kind of been not understood through this conservation and adaptive reuse? So when I work with my site of Shanghai, in the past, there was a very political topic about the class struggle related to the colonial and those working class and the colonial owners for the factories. So the traditional discussion about this topic is class struggle discourses. However, in the recent years, the architecture history or urban history has been transformed to another topic, that is modernity discourses. Considering those factories, those infrastructures is part of the modern society, and the introduction by foreign investment, the merchants, they are providing a modernity approach to the urban life in this area. So here we see a more like a technology transfer, also part of this modernity discussion. So I started to look into the three major phases for the early industrialization of China, particularly in Shanghai. The Western company firstly started in the 1843 to 1861. and to try to do smaller industry, that industry almost connected to the shipbuilding and the textile. And then going to the self-strengthening movement in China, that's also connected to like militaries, cast irons, and textile is one essential part of this movement. And then the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and this moment was the period the foreign countries are allowed to build their factories in a port in the agreed port cities, in the treaty cities. So if we look into the modern manufacturing of this textile productions, the first case I noticed that is Ewo Silk Filiator. It is owned by Jardine Matheson Company. That is still a very important global trading company. And this is very early. And they started to hire one British experienced silk production expert from France and Italian experience. It's quite a mixture. This British kind of engineer, he has the working experience in France and Italian. However, when he started to build this first filiated, he couldn't find proper materials to set up his working workshops. And so I think that is the very beginning moment. We don't have the local support yet. And also this is one remain picture about that moment. So after that, we can find more kind of cotton spinning and weaving company or spinning companies along the waterfront area. And here is the Ewo cotton mill, and they started to build another Ewo afterwards. So when the local government noticed the high profit, they started to do their own investment on the textile for the cotton cloth mill. And this one is made by the central government by a petition, and then they started to find more experienced consulting engineer to work on the design. This time, this mechanic engineer is an American engineer. He has experience in Lowell in the New England area. So this design seems quite a successful one with quite a modern structure in that moment with the big scale, 3-story buildings. So I searched about the Danforth, the Mr. Danforth very short bio, and he had been working in Shanghai for almost 18 years. Like he was approached by a very high officer and then be invited to Shanghai. And during his time in Shanghai, he not only helped for one textile mill, but also the other textile mills around this place to set up further expansions, the new branches offices. And also through the archive study, we find out the first kind of proposal for this textile mill drawing is very local with the brush paints and drawing on the traditional rice paper, and with the roof feature is very similar to the traditional Chinese building in Jiangnan region. But the machine, when they need to import those manufactured equipments, the machine are all arranged by a company inside Manchester, and they have a very clear, very regulated plan for making this machinery arrangement. Yeah. So during this moment in the 1890, this first Shanghai cotton cloth mill company was starting to run, and then a lot of like public textile mills owned by the government started to grow as well. It's a long list. And then the technology getting more, while Ewo cotton mill started to rebuild design by a more like official architects group, Morehead and House Company. They were designing a more like following the trendy jigsaw roof structure with the timber frame in Shanghai. This is the Yiwo cotton mill in 1896. This picture was later. And then the Yiwo company started to grow further, and more workshops and plants were built in the site of the Yangtze River area. And the Shanghai case was very successful, and then the investments of the local companies, they started to go outside of Shanghai, going to the more closer area to the raw material, going to Suzhou, going to Wuxi, going to Nantong and Hangzhou. So our research also take the other cases in this region, like this was in Nantong, Dashen cotton mill, and this is a typical like zigzag roofs with the structure of the textiles, and still unworking. There also one museum is based on the 1898 timber structure of these workshops, and remained some of the machines from that moment. And this is our student rejoin from the survey, and they're still having some like a machine manufacturer of this moment. This one is in Hangzhou, also along the canal, the Grand Canal, the Tongyigong, and this main structure is also made by timber and also supported by the timber columns. And this is another silk filiator in Wuxi, is another two-story timber structure and with the brick walls. And it's also very close to the canal, the big canal along the, and the production is very easy to go outside and for the materials, for the raw materials. And if we look into those details of the timber structure, we still can see the juggling joints. It has some traditional timber structure features in the local craftswork. Although the main like architecture language, it's already been connected to the colonial styles for the more decorative things in the facade. And here, this is one, again, back to Shanghai in the 1922, this number 17 cotton mill that is built by a Japanese company in the end part of the Yangshupu River. And so if we compare that to the similar period in the UK, the late 1860 to around the 1920s, most of the truss are already been cast iron. However, in Shanghai or the other areas of Jiangnan region, we don't have many remains from the cast iron materials for the frames. So when I was concluding by this part of the research, I find out the technicians, engineers, and the contracted, those textile mills are mainly designed by technicians and engineers, and not architect yet, and constructed by local contractor. And they also use the piled machines and brick walls with masonry base. However, the fireproof issue is not very much considered in the textile mill, and the timber is the major structure material. And also we can see the traditional craftswork remains in the details. And that was some like a hypothesis I was thinking, because of the material limitation at that moment, the cast iron or the whole steel productions is only for the military, for the big industry, heavy industries are very limited. So those larger civil buildings or those textile mills, they couldn't find the good resources for the textiles. And also for the technology transfer, we can notice that the UK goes to New England in American, and then going to Yangtze Delta, or they will directly going from UK to Yangtze Delta region. So this is how this technology transfer discussion I was looking at. However, I think this is also very complex part of the textile heritage. It's not just those buildings, it's about the workers as well. So in the traditional writings, in the discussion that we see, the class condition is very much discussed. In the case of the Manchester, we learned the condition of the working class in England, and almost 50, 70 years ago, later, the practice in Shanghai, those textile mill workers has also been considered in a very poor condition of the working condition. The contract labor is a book, is a documentative writing to discuss the poor condition of those textile workers. And also there are classical discussions about the economy, history, and urban history through different disciplines in the discussion about textile legacies. And also those workers, particularly the female textile workers, become another main discussion in gender discussions in the economy history and urban history. And after the 1949, this is a significant change about the working class become the main body for the government, and the labor movement become more memorable instead of being part of the discussion. Here, the 1950s later, female textile workers become the iconic model for the working class, and they are very smart, they are very diligent, and they're productive. And those films, those documentaries, built up a new image of the Chinese workers, particularly in this textile, the number 17 textile mill. And the workers, because they are very well paid and they are kind of has a secured position for a long time, so they're expressed a very happy life in the 1990s until 1990s. However, in urban regeneration process of Shanghai, there was a particular sacrifice about the textile industry, and textile industry was considered no longer suitable for this booming metropolitan for Shanghai, and for its pollution, for its labor intensive. I think it's all similar to other contexts as well. But in this moment, Shanghai started to have a lot of empty industrial sites, particularly those textile sites. They started to do spontaneous reuse, and this spontaneous reuse, they also just looking into the space. So most of the textile machines has not been kept. They were purchased by other remote places for developing new textile mills and going to somewhere like in Jiangsu, or even going to Xinjiang for the textile productions. And then there was another shift is about the industrial waterfront to a livable waterfront. So a lot of effort was made to taking those textile or other industrial buildings to be like leisure places for workable, for recreation and entertainment spaces. Here is the continue of the case of the number 17 cotton mill. They become a fashion outlet, become a car park, and then the building used to be the residential part of the workers has been taken off, become a high-rise residential block. And the interior spaces of the original working spaces become the high ends of the fashion design. So, and the waterfront now, even the work the water plant area normally is forbidden, but in order to create this waterfront livable spaces, they built a decking for the external connection. And also this is the whole current bird view for this former industrial zone, and become a very lovely waterfront spaces for this area. However, some part, if this is not very close to the waterfront, like this textile workshop, is still standing unused because they don't find a proper reuse program for the space. And also the housing for the former workers are not really considered as a valuable part for the industrial heritage. And they only consider those manufacturing part is important. The recent work about this area is the former Iwo textile mill restoration project in 2021 to 2024. This is again, was used as a very large textile and also been state-owned and become a good a company for workers. However, during the last regeneration, relocation process, they start to be empty for many years. And also when it is empty, it's become the expansion of the waterworks, which is next to that. So the recent restoration is taking the facade into cleaning the facade and to make the red brick seems as icon for the history very clearly. And then to refurbish all those layers of the time to the so-called old version from the Iwo period. So this is how it is look like right now. Last week I went there, but still not open to the public. This is the facade after the restoration. As it is part of this waterworks now, so they still close the place for still a forbidden area. And this interior spaces, according to the ICADI as the Design Institute, what they do is to restore the timber structure for the roofs. And from this one, I feel a little complicated saying all those traces of the technology details may not be revealed through this restoration. So this is one part of the space and the material part. However, another discussion recently arose about this heritage is the everyday life of the textile mill workers, how they engaged with these urban activities and the relation of those living compounds and to the manufacturing part. And a series of the scholars has did this former dormitory housing area for the cotton mill. And they started to do documentation and try to understand how the families was growing through the time and how this textile mill impacted their life for the everyday life discourses. And also, interestingly, through this survey of those textile working houses, the very important class discussion about the prototype unit for the tractor labor now has been rediscovered. And this was in a very poor condition. This condition is hardly to be regenerated. And so it's still under the regeneration plan. But actually, this part is very tricky to regenerate. Are we going to make it like high-end apartment again, or it's been part of the memory? So in this end, I'm talking about the industrial polarizative discourses, mainly on the technology history discourses in the recent years is becoming a richer narrative of different industrial pasts. Okay, so that's my part of the presentation, and I hope that we'll have more questions after the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Dom. Very, really comprehensive presentation of the textile industry and its heritage, touching so many different aspects. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions later. I love the idea, by the way, of adaptive abuse. It's a very, very clever one. So thanks, and we move to our next presentation, which is Salford Twist Mill, uncovering an iconic textile factory. that is going to be delivered by Ian Miller, who is the director of the Greater Manchester Archaeological Advisory Service, which is housed at the University of Salford in England. Ian Miller is also the co-editor of Industrial Archaeology Review. Until recently, he was the co-editor together with Ian West, but now he is the co-editor together with Amber Patrick. And as you may know, Industrial Archaeology Review, which is published by Taylor and Francis, is so far the only monographic journal on industrial archaeology, industrial heritage, indexed in the Web of Science. So Ian Miller, he has more than 35 years of professional experience in archaeology and is very much a renowned specialist in the industrial archaeology, particularly in England and North England, with plenty of experience and plenty of expertise in the glass industry, industrial townscapes, and of course, the textile industry, which is the topic he's going to talk today. Related to the textile industry, Ian led the Lancashire Textile Mill Survey and other works related to it that were developed later. And also he compiled for Historic England the introduction to heritage assets related to the textile mills. So thank you very much, Ian. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, just mix well, Antonio. Go on. That's what I do. No, just the other side as well. Let's see. You're doing nice. Very good. Yeah, just to do this one. It's enough. It's enough. It's enough. Put it there. Not here. Well, your ends is Anthony. Then you have a little flour.
Yeah. Are you there?
But let me show you how quick is the sauce. I have 2 tins of a tomato. Then we have 3 cloves of garlic.
It's very low voice.
Yeah. And sorry, and we are seeing your screen, but we are not listening to you. We can't hear you.
Okay, I think we're sorted. Can you see my screen?
Yes, now we can see your screen and we can listen to you. Okay, so please go
excellent.
ahead.
Well, thank you very much for that very the excellent introduction. I think you've over-egged me completely. But yes, I'm delighted to talk to everybody. I'm the County Archaeologist for Greater Manchester, and I was hoping to share a presentation on an excavation that was done some years ago in Salford, the Salford Twist Mill, 1799 to 1801. Now, this has attracted quite a bit of attention as a pioneering example of an iron frame building and the first textile mill in England to have benefited from steam heating, and was also one of the earliest buildings in the world to have been permanently lit by gas. Aspects of the mill's development have been debated since its destruction in the mid-20th century, although several points of contention have been clarified during the excavation, and of course the associated research that was carried out by the University of Salford back in 2016-2017. So I intend to provide a pretty brief overview really of this iconic textile mill, with particular reference to the structural frame and the significance of which has perhaps not secured the full recognition that it maybe deserves. So where is this site? The site of Salford Twist Mill lies on the edge of the historic core of Salford city centre, on the opposite bank of the River Irwell to a city most people will have heard of, which is Manchester, located up in the northwest of England. I think one of the things I always really like to stress is that Salford is a separate city to Manchester, although many people these days really see it as a bit of a suburb. That's not the case. It has its own distinguished and unique history, of which I think the Salford Twist Mill played a very important part. The image on the left on your screen is an extract from a late 18th century plan of Salford, produced by a guy called William Green in between 1787 and 1794. And you can see on this, marked by the arrow, is the footprint of the Salford Twist Mill, or at least the first components of that mill, of that mill complex. So this initial part of the mill was erected in 1790 to 92 as a purpose-built factory for the preparation of spinning and spinning of cotton yarn. It was set up by a company called the Salford Engine Twist Company. It is known to have been of 6 stories, including the basement, with internal dimensions of just over 111 feet, or nearly 34 metres, by 35 feet wide, or just over 10 metres. It was a brick construction, as nearly all mills in the Manchester manufacturing district are, with timber beams, which really conforms to the typical design of a late 18th century Arkwright type mill. It has been suggested that the mill was water-powered initially, but the supporting evidence for this is very scant, whilst records in the Bolton and Watt collection in Birmingham show that a 30 horsepower double-acting steam engine with sun and planet gearing was installed in 1791. This was actually the first engine built by the leading engineering firm of Bolton and Watt to be set up in Salford, and it was probably the first steam engine to be installed in a cotton mill in Salford. The partners of the company, I think it's quite important just to mention them, were John and George Phillips, Charles Wood, and Peter Atherton. The Phillips family had established themselves as Manchester's leading exporters of textile goods such as fustians, checks, muslins, calicos, and were therefore were considerably wealthy, whilst Charles Wood was similarly a prominent local merchant and manufacturer of checks. Peter Atherton, however, contributed different experience to the partnership, having gained renown as one of the most successful textile machine makers of the later 18th century. Stanley Chapman, notable researcher of the textile industry in the 20th century, accredits Atherton with him being the first really successful designer of the earliest generation of steam-powered textile mills in the 1790s. As such, Atherton will undoubtedly have played a really significant role in developing the company's first mill, with the Phillips family and Charles Wood almost certainly providing the financial backing. In 1792, with the first mill operating successfully, a guy called George Augustus Lee was invited to join the partnership. George Lee proved to be an engineering genius. He was responsible for the first extension of the mill in around 1795, which comprised another 6-story block that extended the footprint of the mill southwestwards towards the River Irwell, which is shown on this plan in a bit of a light grey area around here. The extension had increased the internal width of 45 by over 13 metres, which reflects its internal use for mule spinning, which was the favoured machine in the Manchester manufacturing district for spinning cotton. This mill was powered by a 30 horsepower engine, again supplied by Bolton and Watt, which was ingeniously set alongside and connected to the original engine. George Lee nicknamed it Pluto, with an original design drawing shown here on the right. By the time the engine was set to work in autumn 1799, George Lee had turned his attention to erecting the third mill, and the one that really is the focus of the excavation and this talk, because it was a revolutionary design. The foundations for this new mill were laid and the walls completed up to the first level of the first tier of beams in 1799. It was to be of 7 stories, including a basement, each story forming a room over 200 feet long, or 63 metres, by 42 feet wide, with an engine room across the northwestern end, creating what was essentially one of the largest cotton mills in the Manchester district at that time. However, there was actually a hiatus in building work at the first level of the beams, which has been a point of discussion with some authorities, suggesting that it was during the following few months that George Lee decided to have an iron frame fitted to the mill rather than traditional timber construction. And it was during these months that he very rapidly refined his design plans, having spent time in the mills of Charles Page in Ditherington and John Marshall in Leeds, who were also working on developing cast iron frames for textile mills. Ditherington Mill, of course, is now recognised as being the world's first iron frame building. Having said this, however, there are documents in the Bolton and Watt collection that suggest Lee had intended to employ cast iron beams from the onset, not least as he had prepared the initial drawings for the mill and shared these with James Watt at Bolton and Watt by May 1800, seemingly with an intention of eliciting some comments on their design. Lee's drawings showed transverse beams to be of two sections joined at mid-span, pretty much as shown in this drawing here, which I'll come to in a second. And Lee's original drawings also had a cross-sectional profile identical to that used at Beige in Ditherington. Having reviewed this design, James Watt recommended that 3 beams should be used instead of 2, joined at the supporting columns, with the columns passing through the joint. Watt also suggested that the ends of the beams should have circular eyes so the clasps to the top of the columns. So after this a short hiatus, construction work on the Salford mill resumed in June 1800, and the walls had been completed to their full height and the internal iron frame installed by November of that year, creating what you can see in this drawing. As you can see there, cast iron frames were employed throughout the mill, although the exception was actually the roof trusses, which were of timber. Now, details of this frame before the brick vaulting and the mill gearing were added is captured in what can only be described as a remarkable perspective drawing, which was produced at Lee's request early in 1801 by William Creighton, who was one of James Watt's draftsmen. This informative drawing was based on Lee's original drawings, although some of the details seem to have been refined, which include the increased width of each bay from 12 foot 10 inches to 14 foot. Both iterations clearly showing that the beams joined at mid-span, suggesting that Lee had rejected some of James Watt's advice. Creighton's drawing here also shows that the iron beams were supported by cylindrical columns, which were structurally more efficient than the slender cruciform cross-section type that they superseded. The Salford Tryst mill was almost certainly the first textile mill to have employed such columns. The drawing also shows that the bottom row of column were fitted with flanges, 2/3 of the way up, presumably to allow steam into the column sections for heating the mill, which again was another first, steam heating in mills. After several changes of plan, a 100 horsepower engine was ordered from Bolton and Watt to power the mill. This was the largest engine for a textile mill recorded in the Bolton and Watt collection until well into the 1820s. The mill was completed by the end of 1801, and the machinery was mostly in place by April 1802. By that date, the Salford Engine Twist Company had been rebranded as Phillips, Wood and Lee, with a further change in a couple of years to the well-known brand of just Phillips and Lee. Okay. So the mill was taken over in the early 1840s by the Manchester Bonded Warehouse Company. The footprint of it is shown very clearly here on the 1890 plan, and you can actually see the scale but narrowness that was so typical of these early mills there on that plan. The building remained in use as a bonded warehouse until at least the 1820s. But the later history of the building is a matter, or has been a matter of some dispute. Some authors believe that the mill building survived until the Second World War, when they were destroyed by aerial bombing in December 1940. But it has been suggested that the iron frame mill may have been dismantled long before that date, and that the structure destroyed in 1940 was a later building. Either way, the site was cleared, and whilst the footprint of the original mill building of 1790-92 was redeveloped as the 5-star Lowry Hotel in 2001, shown in this image, much of the rest of the site remained in use for car parking until plans for redevelopment were submitted in 2016. There was nothing on the site at that time to mark the site of the mill. This area, as I say, being dominated with car parks and the Lowry Hotel, as you can see in this selection of images. As is typical in Greater Manchester, large developments such as this, where there's archaeological interest, was preceded by an archaeological excavation. and this aimed to uncover the available footprints of the 1801 mill. The extent of the excavation area is marked on this extract here from a map of 1850. So as you can see, we effectively got the just less than half of the northern part of the mill. This excavation charted a series of phases in the development of the building. The image on the top right shows the original southwestern wall of the mill, clearly composed of handmade bricks laid for most part in a stretcher bond. The wall was punctuated by regularly spaced cellar lights, whilst an arch aperture that had been blocked up at a later date and visible in the bottom image adjacent to the photographic scale, just here, may have represented the original access to the basement. A square chimney base, shown on the left, occupied the junction of the mill wall and that of the engine room. This had been bricked up by the mid-19th century and a new flue inserted through the southwestern wall of the mill as a result of remodelling and a new power system that was introduced when the mill was converted to a bonded warehouse. The excavation uncovered 4 parallel rows of bases along the basement, each regularly spaced at about 9-foot intervals. These had evidently been laid as at least 2 separate phases of development, with the 2 of the rows representing foundation pads for original cast iron columns. These had formed 23 transverse bays and 3 longitudinal aisles, each bay with a span of 4.2 metres. Quite remarkably, during the excavation, the lower parts of 3 columns remained in situ along the eastern edge of the excavation area, the upper parts having been sheared off just below the flange pipe joint shown on Creighton's drawing. The survival of these columns, amongst other evidence, clearly demonstrated that the iron frame mill had indeed survived until 1940 and hadn't been dismantled as suggested by some authors previously. Each of these foundation pads essentially comprised a rectangular stone block with a square cast iron base set on top that featured this shallow cup seen here in the top right image, and this was designed to receive the foot of an unusual type of cast iron column. This cylindrical column type featured a closed hemispherical foot, which is shown here. Comparable examples have actually been identified, the first in the basement structure of Albion Mill in Manchester that was built in 1802, the design of which the esteemed Ron Fitzgerald attributed to a misguided attempt to compensate for movement. That might well have been the case, but further examples of this column with a rounded foot were excavated very recently during the excavation of the Jersey Street Mill in Manchester, which actually dated to 1824. These particular examples had a wide collar to the foot, offering a slight improvement to those in the Salford Mill, but they do nevertheless demonstrate the longevity of this basic design. Fragments of several beams derived from the original cast iron frame were also recovered from the excavation, and whilst none of these were complete, there was sufficient evidence to show how the beams had probably joined together and interlocked with the columns. All of the beam fragments found during this excavation displayed an inverted T-section profile with a flange along the bottom edge to support the brick vaulting springing from each side. The design of these beams displayed a very close resemblance to those used in the Ditherington Flax Mill a couple of years previously, although a key modification was the addition of small lips to provide a proper seating for the brick arches, and really this represents the genesis of the inverted T-shaped flange beam that became so ubiquitous through the 19th century in iron frame buildings. Several fragments of the excavated beams contained a pair of rectangular holes, which you can see quite clearly on some of these images. And these were intended to house longitudinal wrought iron tie rods to counteract any displacement generated from the thrust of the floor arches. Another beam fragment had a projecting bolting eye, again seen clearly here, which was cast to the end of the beam. and this was almost certainly intended to receive a spigot on the head plate of the underlying column, allowing the columns to actually interconnect, which we tried to reproduce on that drawing on the right. I think what is important is that the archaeological evidence has also shown that the transverse beams were each of 4 sections, with a bolted connection at the midpoint of a central aisle, just as shown on Creighton's drawing, but with additional complex joints around the original columns on each side. And this is not something that's shown in any of the documentary material for the mill. So, really to conclude, being conscious of time, this excavation and the associated research of the Salford Twist Mill, I really feel has thrown quite a bit of interesting new light on the development and physical structure of what can only be seen as one of the most significant historic cotton mills in the Manchester manufacturing district. The documentary evidence points to George Lee having been largely responsible and instrumental to the design of a cast iron frame for the Salford Mill, rather than it having been the work of Bolton and Watt, as has been stated by some authors, including the eminent engineer William Fairbairn in 1854. Lee will undoubtedly have drawn on the earlier work of people like Strutt in Belper, Page in Shrewsbury, and Marshall in Leeds, and will have benefited from the advice offered by Bolton and Watt, which would nevertheless be accredited with making a significant contribution to the successful application of cast iron in the construction of multi-storey buildings. On a final note, I think it's also important to note that the work, I feel, has demonstrated the research value of excavating the sites of early steam-powered mills archaeologically and using the physical evidence from those excavations to interrogate the documentary record for the development of individual sites and to test the wider understanding of how the design of multi-storey mills evolved. And with that, I would like to hand on or hand back and stop sharing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Very informative presentation that I was particularly interested in this presentation because it can show, you actually show pretty well what archaeology can contribute to our knowledge of the industrial past, in this case of this particular site. Because, well, this is something that is pretty well known in the UK and also in the USA. We have today some colleagues from the Society of Industrial Archaeology as well. But in the East, it's not so common that archaeology studies modern sites. And so the idea of industrial archaeology as the proper archaeological analysis of the material evidence of the industrial period is not so common on the East as well, at least when compared to the West. So this was a very good example indeed of what archaeology can tell us about the industrial past. So thank you very much. And we move now to our third presentation today, which is the global textile industries and their built heritage, that is going to be presented by Mark Watson from Historic Environment Scotland, more precisely from the External Relations and Partnerships Directorate. Watson has a degree in history by the University of Oxford and also on industrial archaeology by the University of Birmingham. Sadly, this degree does not exist anymore, but lucky enough, Mark had the chance to take it. He has a very long work experience with the museum and heritage sector, mostly in Scotland, but also beyond. And in relation to this, in relation to the heritage and industrial heritage sector, for example, he wrote the nomination for New Lanark to be included in the UNESCO World Heritage List, which was successfully done in 2001. And also he worked for the nomination of the Forth Bridge around Edinburgh that was inscribed in 2015. Besides, Watson has contributed to heritage projects such as that of the Knockandoll and Stanley Mills, both of then award by Europa Nostra. So, well, I would like to say that if you want your industrial site to succeed, maybe Mark Watson is the person you should talk to. He's the UK national representative for Tiki, and together with Oberman and Walsack, who is also today here with us, thank you very much for that. He led the study and the publication of the Tiki comparative study, The Heritage of the Textile Industry, which is part of the content he's going to share with us today. So, Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that great introduction. I feel a bit embarrassed to be in such company, and if it seems that I am only talking about successes, that's because I tend to not discuss the failures quite so much, though one day that can be another presentation. This is a great day. I'm very pleased so many people are attending this meeting, and many of them were people who supported this specific project that I will talk about, which is the comparative thematic study of textile sites by TICI, the International Committee for the Conservation of the Industrial Heritage. And because the topic is East-West, I'm showing on the left the India Mill chimney, which is in Darwin, Lancashire, and a very fine thing it is too, but it's called India because it's obviously paying tribute to the empire that then extended to include that fantastic country, and it was built in 1873. And it's also in an Italian style, I would say, a campanile. So the textile industry, as Yiping Dong has very effectively explained, is a global phenomenon. And I think it's not so much the heritage of globalization, so much as the globalization of heritage that's been achieved by this project. But the textile industry was behind the growth of many cities, creation of company towns, and it relied on worldwide trading routes developed since the Middle Ages in silk and wool, linen, cotton, and jute, and more recently artificial fibers. They face global economic challenges today, so that many of the textile mills that were built for one purpose are now adapted into other purposes. They are adaptable buildings, and therefore I think to rely on continued use by a specific industry is probably not the way to go, wherever you are in the world. And as Professor Dong has explained, even many of the early textile mills in Shanghai have now accommodate creative industries rather more than just producing cotton cloth. So the group that came together to discuss the textile industry more than 20 years ago defined some topics, headline ways of defining sites, including the flagship, which is actually a term coined by my old tutor, Barry Trinder, in which he devised for food industry sites, but I think they do apply also to textile mills. Which are the giants, which are the time capsules which contain historic machinery, and which are the networks that best demonstrate international interchange. Did the company towns fail or did they prosper? Are they so linked to one specific industry that they will be in trouble when that industry stops? And a very small number are World Heritage sites. Is the balance correct? Are some parts of the world capable of contributing sites to that World Heritage list, which we need to consider more rather than just take the Eurocentric view that we may have, or some of us have. I do, certainly. So these are the three authors that came together to create a publication derived from the list of sites which had been put online for almost 20 years. And there were two professors among them, Heike Overman on the left and Bartosz Walczak on the right, professors of architecture, both of them. Heike was particularly interested in urbanism and the place of the textile mill in the city. And that's the subject of a book of hers, which came out almost simultaneously with the textile book produced by Tiki. And Professor Volczak on the right, I owe a lot to him for having taken out the sites under the headings I've just described and put them into countries, so they're much more easy to look up, and geo-referencing them longitude and latitude, and also because of his knowledge of Russian, his ability to insert into that list quite a lot more giants that were big in the Soviet Union and the countries in that sphere of influence. So Heike and I are shown on the left at the Tiki Congress, the last one to take place in Montreal. The next one coming up is in Sweden, so look out for that. And very recently I was in Poland, so that was Bartosz in front of the Scheibler mill at Szanghmiln, in the south side of the city of Łódź, and on the north side is the Poznański cotton mill, which is now a hotel. And it's really startling transformation with these egg-shaped holes cut through the building to bring light into the middle. And I think that's a solution that needs to be done for quite a lot of the bigger cotton mills that we are left with today. And that's now a very smart hotel. And there's a small robot that trundles around like Wall-E, tidying up after people. So it's quite surreal to have come into that in the Manufaktura complex, where all of this was the Israel Poznański complex, which was the second biggest in Łódź. And now it's attracting millions of visitors to the fun fair, the multiplex cinema, the small museum, the restaurants, and the car parking on top of the weaving shed. So the tower you see here, I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, is this tower here at the back of Manufaktura. And this is the view from the swimming pool, which is installed in a wrought iron cistern on the top floor of a cotton mill that was built in 1878, iron framed. And I also very much appreciate the way that French architects and developers have tackled the big cotton mills. There, quite a robust approach is taken. It's okay to knock holes where appropriate into these buildings, to bridge over spaces between them, and to change the roofs, add things to the roofs in a contrasting way. All of these are quite exciting things that you can do with textile mills, but probably not if they're World Heritage Sites, because UNESCO is far, far behind the way of thinking of most conservators. So Tiki has a section of thematic studies and published reports, and because the textile one is the most recently published as a book and as a PDF, that one comes to the top. And I've shared a link to it, which takes you to the Technical University of Łódź, where you can download it for free. There were very few printed copies. If there's sufficient demand, I hope it'd be possible to produce a new edition, perhaps with updates. But you can see it's in good company with other studies of the oil industry, water, petroleum, the context for World Heritage Bridges, which goes back quite a long way by the late Eric Deloney, railways, canals, collieries, and so on. So these fit into a series that was produced in order to support ICOMOS, which is the advisor to UNESCO on World Heritage nominations. But they're not only for World Heritage. Obviously, you can then use these as a guide to the textile mills that you are particularly interested in researching. We benefited a lot from the fact that a worldwide pandemic broke out. The book might not have come out if it weren't for that. And that enabled us to reach out to researchers around the world in 2 seminars that were supposed to have taken place in Europe, but because they didn't, because of the pandemic, we were able to do these online by Zoom. And that, I think, has resulted in a better balanced, globally, series of ideas and suggestions about the sites that are important around the world. And I should point out on the left-hand side with the white hand, that is Eusebi Casanales, who was president of Tiki at the time. And he took me aside one day and asked me to do a comparative study of textile sites into which all the others could fit. And that I could only do that with a great deal of help from other people. And he's underneath the current president of TICI, who is Miles Oglethorpe. So we had these workshops in 2020 and 2021, and that a lot of the material that was gathered from there subsequently got into the book. The comparative study isn't finished. We'd like you to tell us more about the places we've missed, or maybe the ones that have burnt down or are so dramatically altered now that perhaps they shouldn't be in the next book. One of the pieces of feedback we got was, how could we possibly give more words to Netherlands than Belgium? And perhaps we shouldn't have done, because the Belgian sites are so much bigger and better than the ones, the relatively few that survive in the Netherlands. But we did have to reduce quite a lot of the text that is about each of these sites. So it's become more telegrammatic, where there's just one, well, it's about a place and not even whole sentences in the gazetteer element of the book. But there are essays, and some of those essays tackle the supply chains, such as cotton coming from Egypt and Central Asia, and we benefited from Mirhan Damir from Egypt on the cotton presses that exist in Alexandria. And I was already aware of the jute coming from Bengal, now mostly Bangladesh, as well as India, and silk being traded via the Silk Route across Central Asia from China, especially, and countries round about, including Japan. And there are other aspects, maybe you could describe as dark history, child labor being used in textile mills. In the 18th century, textile mills in Britain used a lot of children, but that was phased out as machines got bigger in the 19th century, and also as factory legislation and education legislation came in, whereas certain states in the United States of America didn't do that. And so a lot of the photographs that you might find of children, this is Sadie Pfeiffer, who's 1.2 meters high, working in Lancaster Mills, North Carolina in 1908. A lot of these photographs were taken by Louis W. Hine as part of a campaign to bring American legislation into line with the factory legislation that existed in Europe. But that's a good resource. And we also found out a bit more about the global supply chain from the south, southern hemisphere. So Michael Pearson presented us with photographs he has of wool gathering into the Woolmer's woodshed here in Tasmania and Australia, and also in Chile, in Patagonia. So now the research has extended into the global south. And there's another aspect, of course, needs to be mentioned, which is slavery, which and the plantations worked by enslaved people in the Caribbean, in South America, and then in the southern states of the United States of America, until the American Civil War brought that to an end. So there are plantations that are presented as heritage in, for example, Natchitoches in Louisiana, which include the premises provided for enslaved people. And so that's a bit of dark heritage that needs to be recognized. But it's not something that is a new discovery by woke historians in the last couple of years. It was known and perfectly well presented by Anthony Burton in his television series for the BBC in 1984. And before then, in the early 1980s, and then it was publicized as a book. So we've known, and anybody who knows much about the industry will have known that the enslaved people were involved in the cultivation of quite a lot of the cotton that was being used in Europe and in the United Kingdom. Luckily, that wasn't quite so well known, perhaps in 2001, when the three World Heritage nominations from the UK went through in one go for New Lanark and Derwent Valley Mills. Both of those were cotton mills. And then the ambassador from Egypt spoke up in our support, saying undoubtedly the cotton they used came from Egypt, which is the best. and we kept rather under our hats the fact that a lot of it was produced in the Americas by enslaved people. But now, especially the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site is reversing or is doing its best to explain that background to their heritage. So we've already got into what makes textile heritage important, and the fact that at New Lanark, a nomination had gone into UNESCO in 1986, and it was first of all deferred and then referred by UNESCO, who asked for a comparative analysis of 19th century industrial sites and ideas. So that's New Lanark, the top slide, top photograph. Did nothing to achieve that for another 14 or 15 years while we were waiting for other people to do it. Then it sort of fell into my in tray that the UK tentative list was revised, and Keith Faulkner had a hand in that, and also found himself then having to set out what might be World Heritage Sites in Manchester and the Great Western Railway and a number of others, Liverpool, and also the Derwent Valley Mills. And they were joined up sites. But because thanks to a 2000, in the year 2000, there was an accord signed between Tiki and ICOMOS so that we wouldn't tread on each other's toes excessively. And therefore, an agreement was made that comparative studies, which were already underway, would be adopted by ICOMOS in its review of World Heritage nominations. And already the first of the places to have industrial textile production on an industrial scale also happened to be a company town, which was Crespi d'Adda in Italy. And that's a photograph of the base of the chimney, lower right. The study, what that was before a study had gone into the comparative study of all the other textile sites around the world. So I'm not sure that Crespi d'Adda would have come top as the best in the way that ICOMOS and UNESCO expected. So a Tiki textile section got together, and we had meetings in Terrassa in Spain, Catalonia, and then a meeting in Germany, which then did site visits in Germany and also in Belgium, ending up in Verviers, and that's the Wallonia, a woolen town, and that's the solventing process being examined on the top right slide. And then there was a further meeting in Sedan in the east of France in 2007, and that's a jacquard loom in the weaving shed there. So there's a continuing textile industry, but only just. So we adopted these headings: pioneer, flagship, giant, international exchange, time capsule, urbanism, and landscape, which covers things quite well, I think, and doesn't go down the route of saying which is the best cotton mill, which is the best silk mill, because that might not mean as much in terms of outstanding universal value. So amongst the pioneers, as both of the previous speakers have mentioned, there's the Ditherington Flax Mill, now called the Shrewsbury Flax Mill Maltings. And this is it before the works, or as the works were underway by Historic England, looking through one of the floors, including these columns, which I actually suspect are not the original columns with the bifurcated pads to them, but the original columns are probably those on the left, the cruciform type of column, which Ian mentioned. And also Cromford, obviously, is the first water-powered cotton mill. And then what about the silk mills? Well, there are some in Italy, which are way older than these. And then the flagships, those are the big impressive mills, the big chimneys, and quite a lot of decoration. So Templeton's in Glasgow is perhaps one of them, though there's no intention to make that a World Heritage Site, or Lister's in Bradford, or Cox's Stack in Dundee, nor Poznański. Although there had been an attempt, I understand from Bartosz, to put forward a Jewish World Heritage Site in Łódź, and that has not progressed as far as UNESCO yet. And Israel Poznański was, of course, Jewish, and he established this mill, but died just before the Nazis arrived. And then looking at the giants, which are the biggest ones, and you could count the number of employees, the number of spindles, or the number of looms. And on most counts, the Amos Craig factory complex in Manchester, New Hampshire, wins as biggest. And there's a lot of it left, and I'm quite impressed at what's been done in Manchester, New Hampshire. So there are 67 housing blocks forming a National Historic District of their own. So that's an important place to remember. And biggest in Europe is Greenholm Mills in Narva, on the very edge of Estonia. And this is the Uala ring spinning mill, named after a popular singer of the interwar period. And this is ring spinning going on in that iron-framed mill. And these mills closed in 2008. So we're looking from a tower within the mill complex at Crow's Island, which had waterfalls in either side of it. Russia is on the left, where there's the Stieglitz flax mills, which were managed by Scots and in fact built by Fairbairn. And on the right, there are more of the spinning and weaving factories that are part of the Greenholm complex. And there's a hospital and assorted housing, making this a company town as well, pretty much. So other giants, you'd have to pick the time period, so that the biggest complexes in about 1800 were Belper in England and New Lanark in Scotland. And by about 1900, the biggest, or one of the biggest cotton mills was the Scheibler complex of Shanzmiln in Łódź in Poland, because it was just inside the borders and the tariffs of the Russian Empire, and that they had the whole Russian market to focus on, as also did Greenholm and Tampere, Finlayson's mills, for example. So bottom left, we have Scheibler's power station, which when I was there a few weeks ago, had a lot of pumpkins in it, and there was one boiler retained in that complex. And if you look at the biggest of the woolen mills, well, maybe Dean Clough in Halifax, which made carpets and has been spectacularly reused in the United Kingdom, should be considered. For international interchange, which I equate to criterion 2 of the World Heritage cultural criteria. So an interchange of human values over a span of time within a cultural area on developments in architecture and so on. There was a very specific link in the export of technology, which was illegal at the time, from the United Kingdom to USA. So it went from Belper in Derbyshire, which is now a World Heritage Site, to Pawtucket in the USA, which is not, but which is one that Pat Malone, who joined us very early this morning, knows extremely well. So that's a good example of two sites connected across continents. And also Yiping Dong mentioned the technological transfer involved in getting Tomioka silk mill, which was inscribed in 2014 under criteria 2 and 4. So I got that into the presentation just now. Was a fusion of Japanese practices in the timber frame that was used, which is good to resist earthquakes, and the use of brick infill between that, which is perhaps the French influence, as well as the machinery that is there. And that World Heritage Site is a serial nomination or inscription, which includes some of the places in which silkworm were cultivated. And so those are silk cocoons on the left, those are mulberry trees on the right, and in the middle is the use of glass imported from France in the laboratories that we needed, and the microscopes that we use in order to examine the quality of the cocoons. In terms of living traditions or so-called intangible heritage, this is very tangible. This is a fulling mill in which the kinetic power of the water is being employed. And you see these across the Balkans and Southeast Europe. So how is technology like this being preserved? I think it's through continued use, hopefully. And then we have the time capsules, machinery that was installed a long time ago in that place. So an example would be the Göteborg Rem fabric, producing heavy-duty banded cloth in Sweden, and continued tapestry weaving in France. And then we have urbanism, and a good example I was in just a couple of weeks ago is Girardov, which was founded by the Frenchman Philippe Girard. Then it was owned by Austrians, but during the First World War it had to be pretended that in fact the ownership was British and maybe the shares and the management was, in order to obtain compensation for the damage done by the Germans. So we're looking across the company town. So pretty much the whole town or city was created to support this linen industry. And the museum there has got some looms going, and it's producing cloth, which when I was there, then went into a fashion show. So designers used the cloth that was being made on these looms. So the industry is being kept alive, but as a museum process. When I first went to Girardov, it was still spinning flax. So that's the photo bottom left. And then I stayed in the hotel that's been formed there, very cheap, in the old mill on the right. And you can see there's been a restoration in the roof, and some of the old windows are hanging up in the corridors of the hotel. And the company town has a lot of the attributes you'd look for, and some that you might not think of, like the hospital that's in the middle, the Resursa, which is a sort of hall for entertainments and activities, as well as housing. These interesting, which you also find in Łódź, two-story outhouses containing the toilets. And some of these have been conserved, most of them have, and also a fire station. So these sites and more went into the publication, which I've put into the chat, and there's a link to it here. Some of these links I hope work. But we don't think that the project has finished there. We hope to get some people to write in angrily and say, you've forgotten about this or that. And you can do that by contacting me at that email address. Here is some of the TICE members at the Congress that took place in northeast France in Lille, but actually in Roubaix here, discussing the mills that we're looking at there and the interesting interventions that have been made in them. And there are landscapes out there that I only knew about thanks to the Quincke Foundation, which supported my field trip to America in 2004, at which I met Pat Malone, I'm delighted to say, and I attended an SIA Congress conference in Providence, Rhode Island, and near there is Fall River, which I had never heard of, but has a fantastic complex of large steam-powered mills, steam-powered because they're by the river and by the sea, and therefore could import coal. So if there's anything missing I've forgotten about, do get in touch with us and send me an email. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this very global view. And I like the twist you made, that maybe this is not the heritage of globalization, but a heritage that came to be globalized or global. So thank you very much. So thanks. So we have now like 30 minutes for the discussion section. Now everybody is welcome to open cameras and microphones if you want to ask any question to the speakers. You can also use the chat facility if you prefer so. If you have a question but prefer to write it rather than to speak, please use the chat facility. So question, please. Anybody wants to break the ice?
While people are thinking of their question, I'll put one to Yiping Dong, who I think gave a very great overview of the global issues before getting into China. You have a good pun there about reuse, or is it abuse of industrial heritage. I think it's maybe down to us, the historians and the conservators, to actually explain what these places are, and not complain if nobody else does, or if the people who are now going shopping in these places don't really appreciate that this used to be a textile mill. We need to perhaps put forward the history of these places rather better than we're doing at the moment. Would you agree?
Yes, I agree. Thank you for pointing out this this phenomenon, like the interpretation of those heritage values to the publics. I think that is crucial for getting people to recognize those very important past related to this particular history. And why I'm talking about abuse, that is in my observation of the real practice in those reuse of the industrial, particular warehouses or the textile mills. This research level, like Juan just explained, the Western context in the, like Ian has using the archaeological approach to the real, very scientific, very precise documentation, and to analyze the components of construction from that like ruin or from that site to explain the real deep of the history, which isn't very much practiced in the Eastern context. The urgent of the using of the space become the main criteria or the priority of the practice. And so that means the harshness of the reuse will probably take the features of those industrial past out of the real building, authentic building. So that's why I put this kind of question: is that abuse or it's a real proper reuse? But I think that relies on the professional bodies like industrial heritage scholars, not only on their documentation, but we need to write those out. Like you did a fantastic publication to make everyone knows this mapping of the global frame. But of course, I would like to contribute for the Chinese context, how these different typologies of the industrial textiles are situated in their like mapping of this technology transfer or the different working stages in the Eastern Asia. So in that sense, I think the professional knowledge and the public life should be well using their interpretation, but now that is missing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for the question, and Ipin for the answer. Any other questions, please?
Yes. It's more of a comment than a question. So I'm the museum director for a brickworks in the UK. And why I'm here at a textile-based seminar is that it's very impressive how much of the silk industry and the cotton industry and the weaving industry generally, and especially in the UK, has been preserved one way or another. There are obviously problems with reusing buildings inappropriately and so on, but certainly when I used to live, for example, in Stroud with the 5 valleys and all its cotton mills running, mills running along the wool mills. That's it. They did
wool mills,
but they were all busy finding new uses for it. What they weren't doing was demolishing. The majority of the buildings were still standing. In the brick industry, it's the complete reverse, with a huge amount is lost. And the only memory really is Brick Lane or Sandy Lane or Kiln Road or whatever. So we're a very unusual survivor. And I just wondered how to stop the rot. It's probably too late, but I'm impressed by the focus on, well, I suppose I'm puzzled. Why was weaving and the textile industry considered so special for so long, and other industries just allowed to disappear? That's my question.
Well, shall I or Ian, do you want to answer?
No, after you, Mark, when I will chip in.
Well, I think, yeah, brick kilns are quite difficult to keep because they're very difficult to adapt, although it has been done, I believe, in Bologna. So go and look at the Industrial Museum there, which is in the brickworks. There are brickworks in Scotland, something like 3 Hoffman kilns survive. One of them is in a museum, where the beehive kilns also survived until a dead body was found in one of them. So then they were swiftly demolished because it was somewhere that somebody had gone to shelter and just died, I'm afraid. So these kilns are difficult to keep. Have a look at Brick Boom in Belgium as well. That's a fantastic place that I saw thanks to the Heritage of Industry tour led by Bill Barksfield here. So that's a place to see in Belgium. And it's a whole area of brickworks, but there's one kiln retained there, but there's evidence in terms of the ground that is sunk all around because of the clay being taken out for these brickworks. And in Scotland, there are 2 collectors of bricks. One of them is called Mark Cranston. He's a retired police sergeant. He lives in the Scottish borders. He has 7,000 bricks. And he's realized, or he's getting under pressure from his family, that he has to find somewhere to put them. So can I suggest that you kindly step in? And they're mostly Scottish bricks, but some of them have come back.
We're trying.
From
I think they want to stay in Scotland.
Well, arguably, but I think Scottish institutions haven't yet seized upon this collection of bricks. But yes, you're right. Why don't you form a Tiki section on the clay and ceramic industries and pursue a comparative study that way? Or maybe join ERI, you probably are a member already, and do a cultural route between brickworks.
I think that idea of doing a comparative study is a good one, because whilst a lot of brickworks were basically very ephemeral, they just kind of came, dug out a field, made bricks and disappeared. And even the kilns could be just put up and taken down because they used the green bricks to make the kilns. There are some, well, I think probably a biggest disappointment with Stuart B Brickworks, which is an absolutely massive London brick company that had 127 chimneys originally, all in the Peterborough area, and huge Hoffman kilns. And they just taken the last chimney down. And it's just so easy to find a way of knocking it all down for housing. So yes, I would like to start a comparative study. So who would I go to?
Get together with the other people that you probably already have some contacts outside of the UK. And if you don't, then start with Brick Boom.
Okay.
There's a brick, I think it's Brick Cathedral cultural route that has been created in Europe as well as ERI.
Yeah.
So the distinctive element is that they're exposed brick from the Middle Ages, so handmade brick.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of brick museums in China, because this way for making bricks are kind of tradition for construction. So it was a kind of new phenomenon to reuse these brick kilns to be the museum for its production, and also display the process of the whole like material from the mud into the brick, bacon, and the traditional ways of the brick. It's not the like Hoffman's brick kilns for making those things. Yeah, I think it's quite common particularly in the Jiangnan, the Yangtze Delta region, for its highly developed construction tradition. Will be interesting to connect that.
Thank you. It would be. Sorry, I've hijacked a textile conference. I'll shut up now.
So thank you very much for your question, Caroline Hines, for the answers. More questions? I have a question for Ian Miller. I read in the article about your presentation in Industrial Archaeology Review that one of these columns has been preserved and is now shown there on site. So I wonder, in professional archaeology in the UK, when an industrial site is excavated, what is done with the artifacts and even with the residues that are excavated? Because, well, from my experience in Spain, when we are excavating like Roman sites or medieval sites, everything is preserved in the museum. But considering the amount of materials that the archaeological excavation of an industrial site can provide, and also that perhaps some of them are kind of repetitive, I just don't know what is done with the findings of the excavation of industrial sites. Because I saw in the article too, for example, that several bottles were also found during the excavation. So I don't know what happened with all those findings after the excavation is over.
It's a real problem. Certainly in the northwest, where I operate, there is a bit of a crisis actually in terms of museum collections across the board. Museum stores are basically full, and certainly across Greater Manchester, none of them are accepting any material from any sites. And in the list of material that they would consider, I'm sorry to say that stuff from an industrial site will be right at the bottom of the list. So retention effectively is not a realistic option, which is why we go wholeheartedly for full recording as much as we can. And yeah, a couple of the beams from the Salford Twistma, we talked to the developer, and you know, this is a special case in many respects. We made really highlighted the importance of them as a very early type of cast iron beam, the significance of the mill. And there are just two columns and a single beam that have been installed as a piece of public art. Certainly best for nothing, but I mean, that is really it in terms of the material that's been retained. Yes, there are boxes of other material that are hiding in a basement, but I don't think they've got any future, to be honest, because nobody's willing to accept them or take them. It's a worrying situation, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I suspected it should be perhaps kind of like that, because, well, that I guess is like the normal situation. Well, I remember in Spain till not many years ago, well, when I was an archaeology student, sometimes the bulldozers, the machines were used to excavate until medieval levels were found. So all that was directly lost, the evidence for the modern and contemporary times. But well, that is changing too, but I don't think the archaeological museums in Spain are taking that amount of materials that, well, are really too much and very difficult to manage. Okay, so well, thank you, Ian. More questions, please? We have some comments on the chat facility. Is further comments on?
It's mainly talking about bricks, I'm afraid. We're having a side debate. Maybe
Okay.
if a textile mill made of brick is presenting the products of the brick industry, then we're doing a little bit to help.
Yeah, that moves me to a question for you, Mark. Well, I see in this degree report there are hundreds, if not thousands, of textile industries, historical textile industries all over the world. So what does a site need to enter the UNESCO World Heritage list?
Well, you need to have the backing of the state party, which is the government of your country. And that's quite often the most difficult thing to achieve. But it might help to get some leverage if you can point to other people around the world to say, gosh, this is a really good site. I've never seen anything quite like that before. And when you're faced with comparing a lot of textile mills that are of tremendous quality and where they have been very well conserved, I think of the example of the Finlayson mills and the other at Tampella and others in Tampere in Finland, and they're beautiful and fantastic. And the Finns, or there were people in Finland who thought, yes, let's put this forward. And then they held a meeting in 2010 of Tiki Work Lab and Ecotech. And I gave a presentation, and I feel sorry about this now, saying, look at all these similar places in New England. There's Lawrence, Lowell, Manchester, New Hampshire. There's Saco, Biddeford, all water-powered sites, all great big brick-built mills, and the associated company towns are very well looked after. And then the people in Finland thought, oh, well then we give up. And I think that's a shame, because I think the Tampere sites are spectacularly well looked after and brilliant and wonderful to visit. But I think the conclusion that might have been formed in Finland is that they just can't demonstrate above and beyond a value of the Finlayson and Tampere sites compared to others around the world. So maybe too much knowledge can be a bit of a problem as well. But on the other hand, some of the sites that are on the World Heritage List, are they really the best? I hesitate to be absolutely certain about that. If you look at bridges, we know there are 8 transporter bridges in the world, and there's one on the World Heritage List, which is the most damaged one and most rebuilt after the Spanish Civil War. So is it absolutely the best, or should there actually have been a serial site taking all of them in? I think the latter, UNESCO, state parties and ICOMOS don't like serial sites, so it's not going to happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. More questions or comments?
Yeah,
Roger.
Yeah,
Roger,
I've
please.
just got, if I could screen share for a moment, I've got some pictures here of the ironwork, reconstructed ironwork from the Salford Twist Mill.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right, can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
I know, it's laughable, isn't it?
it's a bit yeah, it's a bit cracked, but there it is. There's some
Oh, that's brilliant. I must go and see that.
Yeah, that's quite good. You can see some of the things that are.
But maybe there could be an explanation put up saying that it's not quite right.
Yeah, it's a bit sort of we've got one in Stockport, of course, the reconstructed ironwork of Palmer Mills, which is sort of basically correct, but it's yes, at least we got it there. They do these sorts of things, so that's a base. Not quite sure how that.
So that's not the base of the 1801 column.
No, it's a late 19th. Both the columns are late 19th century. But the actual beam is original.
Yeah, they are. But that's it.
Better than nothing.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for sharing. That is good.
Thanks for sharing those, Roger.
Thanks, Roger.
Actually, I'll just make a comment. I was interested in China. There is some machinery from John Hetherington's. Maybe you're out to come and see it one day. John Hetherington, one of the Manchester manufacturers.
Yeah, that's also amazing. When I was checking the archives, I saw those like a very big plan for how these machines was displayed and then organized in the workshop space. And that means the technology was entirely imported by the Manchester company, including the machine. And I suppose there might be a engineer also travels to here and to organize the setting of these machines. Yeah.
One of the sad things is we've got Preston Lancashire Archives, what they call the Platt Saco Lowell Archive, contains order books for a lot of the textile machinery manufacturers, but unfortunately, there's very little in that archive from Hetherington. In fact, there's only three books, 2 of which are wrongly catalogued. But so unfortunately, there's no way of looking up at this end the orders for those, which would have been an interesting exercise. I have done for some of the Japanese mills, for example. I've been able to put researchers into that archive, but unfortunately, if it's Hetherington, there's not much chance.
There is a lot of Platt brother machinery around the world.
Yes,
so
of course.
They obviously had a large slice of the market.
Absolutely.
And then the German copies of the British machinery then undercut and also went around the world.
Yes, Platt's records are much more extensive, so you have more chance if they're Platt's of finding them. Yeah.
Okay.
I see a question by Gray F. Is that Gray Fitzsimmons? Is it Gray Fitzsimmons? Did I meet you in Lowell?
Yes, I think so.
I did.
Yes, you
Yeah,
did.
that was fantastic. You know your stuff very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I should thank you as amongst the people in America that helped me, pointed me in the right direction. And I know that Empire of Cotton book by Sven Beckert. It's very good. So
Yeah,
that's good for context. It doesn't name sites.
I just wondered if there were some others besides Sven Beckert's book that you found very valuable.
I probably should read more because there's more and more coming out. I've encountered quite a lot about the Japanese cotton industry and the way that they found a market in India. So the Japanese cotton clothing was going to India, not as Gandhi made out that the Indian industry wasn't in trouble facing British competition. It was competition from Japan that went alongside the very large indigenous, because it was owned by Indian people for the most part, cotton industry in Mumbai.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
More questions?
But thank you for recommending the book.
Please.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. First, thank you, Juan, and thanks for the three scholars for their sharing the presentation. I have a question. I would like to ask Mark a question. First, in 2018, I investigate the alum in Whitby. I found that the coastal textile industry and the alum industry or the symbiotic relationship. So I wonder. I would like to ask you, Mark, whether he has similar case studies in your research, or have you found found the same cases in your research? Okay, thank you.
So symbiotic is a great word, and we should use it more often. And I think it means if it's a relationship between two places, then they are tied to each other and their fortunes are linked. So my example would then be Belper and Pawtucket in Rhode Island, but it could similarly be said about other places. So, for example, the Coates and Clark thread companies that were established in Paisley in Scotland got round tariffs that were set up at the end of the 19th century by taking over companies that were also making cotton thread, including in America. So there are factories also in Pawtucket, which belonged to Coates, and Clark had factories in New Jersey, Paterson, New Jersey, I think it was. And there is still a Coates mill in Łódź, which is one of the few still going. And there are also branches in Budapest and in Spain and in South America. So they have a very close relationship. And when I was in the company town Borgonya in Catalonia, north of Barcelona, there was a whole room full of archives, which was correspondence from Glasgow and Paisley, sending drawings and this is what you need to do this or that. And there's a Paisley street in the town, and the football club in Borgonya has the same football strip as the football club in Paisley. So there are these cultural links which exist to this day. And I'm not sure if people in Paisley are quite as aware of it as people in Borgonia, but there is a symbiotic relationship. But I would like you, the researchers out there, to tell us about these places and write in, and then we can try and pursue them if the archives survive at this end, or maybe you can fill the gaps that we don't know about.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks, Xijin, for your question. Any other questions, please? So I have a final question for Ipin Dom. In your presentation, because I am particularly interested in your topic because, well, I am myself studying, although not with the textile industry, but with the railways. But I am studying the early period of the railways in China, and the international transfers and international participation in the early railways of China. So one of the things that we are interested, my group, I see many of my students here, one of the things we are interested in doing is to be able to distinguish what buildings were built by foreigners or following foreign building materials and techniques, and which ones were more like Chinese made. In your presentation, you have shown already some of these clues, how we can distinguish, for example, on the frames, of the wooden frames of the roofs, foreign and Chinese techniques of doing this. But if you could offer any other, like, what are the main features that let us distinguish in this early industrial period of China, what main features let us distinguish what building is a foreign one and what building is a Chinese one, and even more, if it is possible, perhaps it is not, to distinguish the country in the case of the foreign buildings, if there are particular characteristics for those that were built, for example, by British companies, or those that were built by France or Belgium or any other country.
Well, thank you. I think this is a very important question. Thanks for making that out. That is also why I made my research about this textile mill in the 2015 to 2017. It's a very small scale case to understand the history of those architecture in the industrial discipline. Like, normally those architecture historians, we have a larger field of vernacular buildings and also the field of those palatial buildings for survey. But there's no such a kind of interest in the past to look into the details about those industrial buildings. Textile was one kind of still standing, and it has the local tradition. So that's why I think the exercise of surveying could make some like samples of the time from different typologies and try to trace that back for the technology transfer. But it's extremely difficult, and you will need to know a lot of other things rather than the typology from the tectonic detail. It's more difficult than looking into traditional timber structure in the early dynasties. We can have a big database, and through the decades of the researchers' work, you can map all the buildings features in that decades. Say this is from the 12th century, that is from the 15th century. They have the stylish changes very slowly, but it's visible. But for the industrial part, I felt it is difficult because I know, like Ian Miller, you have working in the Manchester area, and also the global differences. Such kind of period is quite condensed, and the technology changes is also super fast. But the change of the technology didn't always reflect in the construction, because there will be slow pace, delayed lags after the real inside the real construction practice. You will meet one like a engineer who has been trained in Japan, but the teacher of this engineer is from UK, and then they have this transfer of the knowledge through this kind of particular routes. So I would say to do this kind of exercise, it's not only looking into the building, it's looking into who is making that. And this may be not related to the national characters detail under identity. It's more about the prevailing technology at this period and how the local support could work on that. Because the case I started with the first spheriator by Ewo, this is the only record I find out saying they couldn't find any screws, because that is not supported in the timber tradition. Most of the timber housing, we don't use nails, we don't use screws, we only use the mortise and tenon as the joint. So that kind of supplies doesn't exist as a modern manufacturing system. So they need to adapt, they need to make up something for them for their own. So the later is easier, and they have the imported hardwares. They have more like smaller workshops could supply on that. But I think that should be an important work, like the archaeologists or architecture historians, they normally do for the other long history, well, making different samples from different types. And then we have a catalog book. And this catalog book could help us to understand which one from where and how these features are standing out. Yeah, sorry. I'm not sure whether I answered that or not.
Yeah, absolutely. You really just gave me a very good advice on how to continue with the research that I am trying to do. So thank you very much for those clues, for those advice, because are very are really useful and valuable. So thank you very much.
I think John is asking some.
Yes, John, please.
Yes, talking about building abroad to escape tariffs. We have an interesting example in Britain where the Barter Shoe Company, based in Zlin in the Czech Republic, were facing tariffs in Britain. And so they established a factory in East Tilbury in Essex. And all the buildings, factory and workers' housing, are designed by Czech architects. And Zlin and East Tilbury look remarkably similar if you visit the two places. The workers' housing have different levels for various levels of staff, all flat roofed, unlike every other building in Essex. The factory, again designed by Czech architects. The two are an interesting comparison of the export of, well, not so much building technology, but building style in this case.
I agree, and I think it shows how far behind British architects were compared to the more advanced thinking that existed on the continent.
Good. Okay, so thanks, John, for your comments too. I think it's time to close this workshop. I believe that the length and the quality of the questions and answers that we have had today is the best proof we have that the three presentations were absolutely amazing. So thank you very much, Ipin, Ian, and Mark for your very interesting, very inspiring presentations. Thanks also, Bill, for taking care of the technical part. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I was very happy to see at some moments more than 90 people. I think we are doing together, people from the East, from the West, and from beyond, a very nice work, a very nice job in exchanging ideas and trying to have a more global vision at the industrial past, its heritage, and archaeology. So thank you very much to all of you. And if you like this series of workshops, as you know, we have twice a year. So very happy to see you again on May 2025. Thank you very much.
And thank you, John, from the AIA. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mhm.